My husband did not simply die on a rain-slicked highway. He was silenced. 3 days after I threw the final handful of dirt onto the casket of the man I loved. The phone rang at 2 in the morning. It was his billionaire boss. He offered no condolences, only a secret that would burn my entire life to the ground. "Do not tell your mother or brother," the voice commanded. "He was murdered, and you are the next target." Hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us without the budget to continue producing the content you love. If you enjoyed today's story and want to help us keep going, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon, where you will find exclusive, true stories that are even longer, more detailed, and feature multiple emotional voice actors bringing to life situations we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can join our community right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the video description and pinned comment. Now, let us begin today's dark journey into the life of Dr. Layla Wright. I am a senior trauma surgeon at Meridian Cross Care, a highly prestigious private hospital in Seattle, where the stakes are perpetually poised between life and death. For over a decade, I have spent my early mornings standing under harsh fluorescent lights, stitching together shattered bodies and fighting the Reaper in silent, freezing emergency rooms. In my line of work, I am known primarily for my hands. The other doctors say Dr. Wright's hands never tremble, not even when the heart monitor flatlines, not even when arterial blood paints the sterile floor. I have always been the anchor in the storm. But those same steady hands were rendered completely paralyzed the moment a grim-faced police officer stood on my porch and handed me a scorched wedding ring belonging to my husband, Elias. The funeral took place under a relentless, freezing Seattle drizzle that seemed to wash the color out of the entire world. The official story provided by the police was frustratingly simple and terribly common. Elias had lost control of his vehicle on a sharp curve due to the slippery roads. A tragic, unavoidable accident. That was exactly what the priest echoed, as heavy drops of water drummed a chaotic rhythm against the black umbrellas of the attendees. I stood at the edge of the grave, staring down at the polished mahogany of the casket, feeling absolutely nothing but a suffocating, echoing void in my chest. Then came the endless embraces. My biological mother, Sylvia, and my older brother, Julian, arrived at the cemetery with a profoundly dramatic display of sorrow. To the casual observer, they played the roles of the devastated, supportive family members absolutely perfectly. Sylvia wept loudly into a monogrammed silk handkerchief, leaning her entire body weight heavily on Julian, who wore a somber, fiercely protective frown. They wrapped their arms around me, whispering endless streams of hollow comfort into my ears. But I am a trauma doctor. My entire medical career is built upon observing the minute, involuntary biological signals of the human body. As Sylvia pulled me into a tight embrace, I felt the rhythm of her chest pressed against mine. Her breathing was entirely too steady. A human being in true, agonizing grief breathes in jagged, erratic gasps, their diaphragms spasming with sorrow. Her heart rate, beating against my shoulder, was completely calm and measured, and when Julian looked down at me to offer his condolences, his eyes betrayed him. His pupils were perfectly constricted, entirely lacking the wide, dark dilation that comes with the adrenaline surge of true emotional trauma. Their grief was a flawless, rehearsed performance, totally void of any genuine empathy. A freezing cold seed of primal doubt planted itself deep in my stomach, though I forced myself to bury it beneath the crushing weight of my own immediate despair. The breaking point arrived on the third night after we buried the man I loved. The house was a suffocating tomb of silence. I was sitting rigidly on the edge of our oversized bed, staring blankly at the empty indentation on his side of the mattress. The glowing red numbers on the digital clock on the nightstand read exactly 2 in the morning. Suddenly, the shrill, violent ring of my cell phone shattered the quiet of the bedroom, The caller identification simply displayed a blocked number. I answered it, my voice raspy and hollow from days of crying. Layla. A deep, commanding voice spoke instantly, not bothering with a greeting. I recognized the harsh cadence immediately, even though I had only interacted with the man a handful of times at lavish corporate banquets. It was Harrison Thorne. He was a notoriously ruthless billionaire in the financial investment sector, and the absolute head of Thorne Enterprises, the massive firm where my mild-mannered Elias worked as a data analyst. Harrison did not offer a single word of sympathy. His voice was sharp and metallic, cutting straight through my thick fog of grief like a surgical scalpel. Layla, listen carefully. Do not tell your mother. Do not alert your brother. Lock your doors. Elias was not in an accident, and you are the next target. For exactly 3 seconds, my exhausted brain struggled to process the sheer, terrifying gravity of his words. Then, a massive psychological shift occurred. The grieving, broken widow died in that dark bedroom, and the elite trauma surgeon woke up. The crushing, paralyzing weight of sorrow instantly evaporated from my limbs, rapidly replaced by a freezing, hyper-focused surge of pure survival instinct. That seed of doubt regarding my mother and brother violently took root and blossomed into absolute clarity. I looked down at my hands. The fingers that had been shaking uncontrollably for the past week suddenly became perfectly, mortally still. "Where do I need to go?" I whispered into the receiver. My tone completely drained of tears and weakness. He gave me an address located deep in the abandoned industrial district. "You have 20 minutes. Ensure you are not followed." I dropped the phone onto the mattress. I stripped off the oversized, tear-soaked sweater I had been hiding in for 3 days. I walked deliberately to the hallway closet and pulled out Elias's heavy wool winter coat. It still smelled faintly of his cedar cologne. I wrapped the thick fabric around my shoulders like a heavy layer of tactical armor. I grabbed my car keys, completely bypassed the illuminated front door, and slipped silently out through the dark side entrance into the freezing, pitch-black night. I did not know what kind of war I was driving into, but I knew with absolute certainty that I was no longer the prey. The drive through the abandoned industrial district was a dizzying blur of driving rain and smeared neon reflections. I parked my vehicle in a designated, lightless alley behind the monolithic glass and steel structure of the Thorne Enterprises financial tower. A heavy, reinforced steel door awaited me, guarded by a solitary biometric scanner. As I approached, the scanner flashed a harsh green, and the heavy internal locking mechanisms disengaged with a loud, metallic clank. I stepped into a stark, concrete elevator that descended far below the street level. There was no floor indicator, only the sickening drop of gravity in my stomach as I plunged into the heavily fortified subterranean depths of Harrison Thorne's empire. The elevator doors parted, revealing a sprawling, windowless bunker bathed in the sterile, icy blue glow of dozens of massive computer server racks. The air down here was artificially chilled, smelling sharply of ozone and overheated electrical wiring. The relentless low hum of cooling fans vibrated against my teeth, serving as a technological heartbeat in the suffocatingly tight space. The sharp shadows cast by the hardware made the room feel like a high-tech crypt. Standing at the center of the room, illuminated by a massive bank of flat monitors, was Harrison Thorne. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit, his face an unreadable mask of hard angles and cold authority. But it was the person standing slightly behind him that made the breath catch in my throat. It was a young woman, her face pale and drawn, wearing a nondescript gray sweater. I recognized her instantly. Her name was Clara, a senior charge nurse who had vanished without a single trace exactly 2 years ago from my family's flagship rehabilitation center. The local police had eventually classified her case as a voluntary disappearance. Yet here she was, standing in a billionaire's underground fortress, clutching a thick paper file to her chest. "Close your mouth, doctor, and step forward," Harrison commanded, his voice echoing flatly off the concrete walls. "We do not have the luxury of time." I walked toward the glowing screens, my eyes darting rapidly between Clara and Harrison. What is she doing here? What is this place? Harrison turned to face me fully, clasping his hands behind his back. The man you buried yesterday was not the man you thought you knew. Elias was never just a mid-level data analyst crunching quarterly projections for my firm. He was a highly specialized, covert financial fraud investigator. I hired your husband specifically to root out the deeply buried rot within the medical market's dark sectors. He was brilliant, he was methodical, and he was hunting your family. My mind reeled, violently trying to reconcile the image of my soft-spoken husband, the man who spent his weekends carefully tending to his tomato garden, with a corporate espionage agent. Before I could speak, Clara stepped forward, her voice trembling but laced with deep-seated, righteous anger. "They are monsters," she whispered, her eyes locking onto mine with desperate intensity. "Your mother and your brother, I saw what they were doing, and when they realized I knew, Mr. Thorne had to extract me before they could silence me permanently." Clara tapped a key on the main console, and the massive screens above us flickered to life. Endless spreadsheets, patient charts, and pharmacy logs cascaded down the monitors in a blinding waterfall of damning data. "Your family is not running rehabilitation centers," Clara explained, pointing to a highlighted column of medical prescriptions. "They are running a massive insurance harvesting farm. They deliberately keep patients sick. Your mother orders the medical staff to administer counteractive medications. If a patient is recovering from a stroke, they are secretly given coagulants that thicken their blood, risking a secondary event and prolonging their stay by weeks, sometimes months. They bill the insurance providers for millions of dollars in extended care and critical interventions that they themselves manufactured. As a trauma surgeon who had sworn a sacred oath to preserve human life, the sheer, calculated cruelty of it struck me like a physical blow to the chest. They were weaponizing medicine. They were deliberately poisoning vulnerable people for profit. The patients in those beds trusted my family, and my mother was using their suffering as a renewable financial resource. "It gets much worse," Harrison interjected, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating baritone. He typed a rapid command, and the medical charts vanished, immediately replaced by dozens of scanned legal documents. They were incorporation papers for offshore accounts, international holding companies, and phantom medical supply distributors. "Elias followed the money," Harrison continued, "and this is what got him killed. Look at the bottom of those documents." I leaned closer to the harsh, unforgiving light of the monitor. At the bottom of every single page, securing millions of dollars in fraudulent transactions and illegal corporate entities, was my signature. It was a flawless forgery, right down to the slight leftward slant of the letters that only I used. They must have spent years practicing the exact stroke of my pen. "They made you the sole legal representative for their entire money laundering network," Harrison stated bluntly, letting the words hang in the freezing air. "Your mother and brother insulated themselves completely. When the federal authorities eventually raid those clinics, Sylvia and Julian will walk away entirely clean. You will be the only one indicted. You will face up to 40 years in a federal penitentiary, and you will be stripped of your medical license forever. You were their ultimate insurance policy, a sacrificial lamb bred from their own blood." My legs threatened to give way entirely, but I locked my knees, my fingernails digging viciously into the soft palms of my hands until I felt the sharp sting of broken skin. My own mother, my own brother. They had built a guillotine over my neck and smiled at me warmly every single Sunday at the family dinner table. The sheer scale of their sociopathy was suffocating. Harrison pressed another button. The screen shifted to a grainy, black-and-white video feed. The timestamp in the corner indicated it was recorded exactly 4 hours before Elias died. It was the security feed from the underground parking garage of our apartment building. The footage showed a figure dressed entirely in black, their face obscured by a heavy hood, sliding silently underneath Elias's vehicle. "Elias knew they were closing in on his investigation," Harrison said softly, the first hint of actual humanity creeping into his metallic voice. "He managed to back up this deleted security footage to my server just before he left the building. That shadow is cutting his brake lines. Your husband did not lose control of his car on a wet road. He was assassinated. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but the blazing, white-hot furnace of rage igniting in my chest instantly boiled them away. I felt a fundamental part of my soul detach and harden into pure ice. Harrison reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and produced a sleek silver laptop. He placed it carefully on the metal desk in front of me. This was Elias's personal machine, Harrison explained. He isolated it from my network before he died. It contains the master ledger, the absolute proof of everything, every forged document, every offshore wire transfer, every poisoned patient, but it is locked behind a final, military-grade encryption layer. Even my best engineers cannot break it. I reached out, my fingertips brushing the freezing metal casing of the computer. The realization hit me with the devastating force of a physical impact. Elias knew he was out of time. He knew the crash was coming. The gentle, brilliant man I loved had used his final hours, his very life, to compile the weapons I would need to survive. He had willingly walked into his own execution to clear the path for my counterattack. I stared down at the blank screen. The silence of the underground room heavy and thick around me. The grief that had paralyzed me for 3 days was entirely gone. In its place was a crystalline, terrifying sense of purpose. They had taken my husband. They had tried to take my freedom and my life's work. I placed both hands firmly on the laptop, feeling the cold metal ground me to the reality of the situation. I was a surgeon, and I knew exactly how to cut out a cancer. I was ready to bring their entire empire crashing down on their heads. The silver laptop sat on the metal desk, humming softly like a sleeping beast. I stared at the glowing prompt demanding a decryption key. Harrison stepped back, giving me the space I needed, while Clara watched with bated breath. My mind raced through 1,000 possibilities. Sylvia and Julian were meticulous, but Elias was a phantom in the digital world. He would never use something as pedestrian as a birthday or a social security number. If my family had captured this machine, they would have tried our wedding anniversary first. I typed the date of our wedding just to test the waters. The screen flashed a harsh red warning. I closed my eyes and let my mind drift back to Elias, stripping away the nightmare of the past few days to find the core of who we were. I remembered a freezing Tuesday evening in November. Exactly 4 years ago, we had driven out to a desolate, unmarked overlook in the Cascade Mountains. There was no cell service, no tourists, just the biting wind and the smell of pine. He had stopped the car, pulled out a bulky, outdated handheld navigation device, and showed me the exact longitude and latitude before getting down on one knee. He told me he wanted to pinpoint the exact mathematical location where his life truly began. It was a secret only the two of us shared. I opened my eyes, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I typed out the coordinates, translating the numbers into words in my head as I pressed the keys. 48 degrees north, 121 degrees west. The harsh red warning dissolved into a soft, welcoming blue. The heavy encryption firewall collapsed, and the desktop materialized. There was only one file on the screen. It was a video document titled simply with my name. My hand shook slightly as I navigated the trackpad and clicked to open it. Elias filled the monitor. The recording appeared to have been made inside his car, illuminated only by the pale light of the dashboard. He looked so incredibly exhausted. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes, and his hair was unkempt. But his gaze was as fierce and loving as the day we met. "Layla," Elias said, his voice crackling slightly through the laptop speakers. "If you are watching this, it means I ran out of time, and Harrison got to you before they did. I am so deeply sorry. My love, I am sorry for lying to you every single day for the past 18 months. I had to keep you in the dark. If you knew, your biological reactions would have given it away, and they would have killed you without hesitation. Your mother and your brother are lethal. Layla, I had to build a case solid enough to destroy them completely, to protect your career, your freedom, and your life." A sharp sob tore its way out of my throat, but I clamped my hand over my mouth, refusing to miss a single syllable. Attached to this video is the complete architectural blueprint of their corruption, Elias continued, his tone shifting from a loving husband to a cold, precise investigator. I mapped every single offshore shell company. I traced the routing numbers for over $30 million of dirty money hidden in secure accounts across the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. It is all there, but there is something else. He leaned closer to the camera. Your family controls your trust fund and the hospital board, meaning they will try to freeze your assets to paralyze you. I anticipated this. I liquidated my private stock portfolios and purchased a massive life insurance policy using an independent broker they cannot touch. It is worth exactly $10 million. The policy is entirely in your name, and the payout is triggered the moment the police file my death certificate. Use it to salt the earth they walk on. The screen went black. I sat completely frozen, the magnitude of his sacrifice crushing the last remnants of breath from my lungs. He had meticulously orchestrated my survival from beyond the grave. He was the bravest man I have ever had the privilege of knowing, Harrison said quietly from the shadows. I turned to look at the billionaire. The cold, mechanical exterior of the ruthless businessman had fractured. For the first time, I saw profound, devastating sorrow in his steel-gray eyes. "Why did you hire him?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "A man of your wealth could have hired a private army. Why go through all of this covert investigation?" Harrison walked slowly toward the monitors, placing a hand against the cool glass. 3 years ago, my daughter, Eleanor, was involved in a severe horseback riding accident. She suffered a complex spinal fracture. My advisors recommended your family's flagship rehabilitation center because it boasted the highest recovery statistics on the West Coast. His jaw clenched so tightly the muscles trembled. She was supposed to be there for a 6-week physical therapy program. She was making excellent progress. Then, suddenly, she developed massive blood clots. She suffered a fatal pulmonary embolism in the middle of the night. It made no medical sense. I demanded an autopsy, but Sylvia had already mobilized an army of lawyers and compromised medical examiners to classify it as a tragic, unavoidable complication. They cremated her before my independent doctors could intervene. Clara stepped forward, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. Eleanor was my patient. She was perfectly healthy. I saw Julian hand the overnight nurse a vial of unauthorized coagulants just hours before she died. They killed a 22-year-old girl just to milk her premium insurance plan for another month of intensive care billing. Harrison looked at me, his eyes burning with a dark, unholy fire. This is not simply about protecting the wife of a loyal employee. Dr. Wright, this is an alliance forged in blood. We are two people who had our absolute entire world stolen by the exact same monsters. The last lingering shadow of the weeping, helpless widow burned away, leaving nothing but cold, sterilized steel in my veins. The sorrow that had choked me was entirely consumed by a frigid, calculated wrath. I reached up and carefully wiped away the single tear resting on my cheek. I turned back to the laptop, my eyes scanning the complex web of bank accounts and forged signatures my husband had died to uncover. I was a surgeon. I knew exactly how to scrub in, how to maintain a perfectly steady hand, and how to slice through diseased tissue without hesitation. My mother and my brother were a malignant tumor that had poisoned everything they touched. "We do not just expose them," I said, my voice echoing with an icy authority that surprised even me. "If we hand this to the police now, they will tie it up in court for 10 years with their lawyers. We need to catch them in the act. We need to publicly and utterly destroy them." Harrison nodded slowly, a predatory smile forming on his lips. "I have the resources. You have the access. How do we set the trap?" The hardest part of any surgical procedure is the preparation. Returning to my empty house, I had to construct a flawless stage for the performance of my life. I scattered empty prescription bottles of heavy sedatives across the kitchen counter, purposefully leaving unwashed coffee mugs piling up in the sink. I stopped brushing my hair. I practiced staring blankly at the wall until my eyes grew red and bloodshot. When Sylvia and Julian finally came to visit 2 days later, I made sure they walked into the suffocating den of a completely broken woman. Sylvia entered first, carrying a steaming thermos of homemade chicken soup, her face perfectly composed into a mask of maternal concern. Julian trailed closely behind her, a thick leather briefcase gripped firmly in his right hand. "Oh, my sweet girl," Sylvia cooed, setting the soup on the counter and wrapping her arms around my rigid shoulders. I forced my muscles to go completely limp, leaning into her embrace while fighting the violent urge to push her away. She smelled of expensive vanilla perfume and cold calculation. "You look terrible, Layla," Julian said smoothly, pulling out a chair at the dining table. "You cannot keep living like a ghost. Elias would not want this for you." I let out a ragged, pathetic sob, burying my face in my hands. "I cannot function. Julian, I cannot even bring myself to open the mail. Everything just hurts too much." This was exactly what they wanted to hear. A predator always waits for the prey to stop struggling before it goes for the throat. Sylvia stroked my matted hair gently. "That is exactly why we are here, darling," Sylvia murmured, her voice dripping with artificial honey. "We want to take the burden off your shoulders. Julian has spoken with the estate lawyers. We have prepared all the necessary inheritance paperwork. You just need to sign a few standard documents, and we will handle all the complex financial transitions. You will not have to worry about a single thing." Julian opened his briefcase and slid a thick stack of densely typed legal contracts across the polished wood of the dining table. He placed a heavy gold pen next to the papers. "Just sign at the bottom of the flagged pages." "Layla," Julian instructed, tapping the paper with his index finger. I picked up the pen with a trembling hand, allowing my eyes to dart erratically across the dense paragraphs. Through the blurry, tear-filled facade I projected, my surgical mind rapidly dissected the legal jargon. These were not inheritance forms. They were irrevocable power of attorney transfers and absolute liability acknowledgments for 3 new offshore medical supply corporations. If I signed these pages, I would be legally claiming ownership of the exact shell companies they used to launder their blood money. They were tying the final knot on the noose around my neck. "It is so much to read," I stammered, my voice cracking perfectly. I let my hand shake violently, causing the gold pen to slip from my fingers and clatter loudly onto the hardwood floor. I began to hyperventilate, clutching my chest and gasping for air as if I were having a severe panic attack. "I cannot do this right now," I wailed, collapsing forward onto the table. "My chest hurts. I cannot breathe." Sylvia exchanged a swift, irritated glance with Julian, but she quickly masked it with a sympathetic sigh. "Hush now. It is all right. We can do this another time, but you must sign them soon. Layla, for your own financial security." They left the documents on the table, completely confident that their heavily medicated, grieving victim would eventually comply. They had lowered their guard. The first phase of the trap was successfully set. 3 nights later, Julian invited me to his sprawling, gated mansion in the wealthy suburbs for a quiet family dinner. I arrived wearing one of Elias's oversized sweaters, my posture slumped and defeated. Deep inside the pocket of that sweater rested a small, encrypted flash drive Harrison Thorne had given me. It contained a highly aggressive, custom-built malware program designed to bypass Julian's private network security and mirror his entire encrypted server directly to Thorne Enterprises. The evening dragged on with agonizing slowness. I picked at my expensive steak, offering nothing but vacant nods and quiet sniffles to their endless streams of fake sympathy. The tension humming beneath my skin was nearly unbearable. I needed Julian to leave his home office unattended. Salvation arrived right after dessert in the form of an unexpected business call on Julian's cell phone. He glanced at the caller identification, his jaw tightening slightly. "Excuse me," Julian said, standing up from the dining table. "I have to take this. It is one of our overseas suppliers. I will take it on the terrace." As soon as the heavy glass doors closed behind him, I stood up, swaying slightly to maintain the illusion of weakness. "I need to use the restroom," I mumbled to Sylvia, who was busy pouring herself another glass of red wine. She merely waved her hand dismissively, not even bothering to look up. I slipped out of the dining room and moved silently down the thickly carpeted hallway. Julian's home office was located at the far end. I turned the brass handle, praying it was unlocked. It clicked open. The room was dark, illuminated only by the cold, pulsing blue light of his massive desktop computer. This was the central hub where he managed the digital logistics of their entire fraudulent empire. I crossed the room in 3 rapid strides, pulling the black flash drive from my pocket. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I located the hidden port on the back of the sleek monitor and shoved the drive in. The screen instantly woke up, flashing a stark black command window. A line of green text began to load. 10%, 30%. The malware was silently ripping through his firewalls, copying every hidden ledger, every encrypted email, and every offshore routing number. 50%, 70%. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps rapidly approaching down the hallway. Julian had finished his call much earlier than anticipated. 90%, come on. The heavy wooden door began to swing open, the progress bar hit 100%, and the screen flashed back to its normal, locked desktop state. I ripped the flash drive from the port and curled it tightly into my palm, but I was still standing directly behind his desk. There was no way to hide. Julian stepped into the office, his eyes instantly snapping to my figure in the dark. A terrifying, predatory darkness washed over his face. The sympathetic brother vanished, replaced entirely by a ruthless criminal who had just caught an intruder in his inner sanctum. "What are you doing in here?" "Layla," Julian demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, interrogating whisper. He took a slow, calculated step toward me, his hands curling into tight fists. I had a fraction of a second to react. If he suspected I was spying, I would not leave this house alive. I needed a distraction so violent and emotional it would completely blind his logic. I spun around, deliberately knocking my elbow hard against the edge of his mahogany bookshelf. A heavy silver-framed family portrait tipped over the edge and crashed violently onto the marble floor, the glass shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. I dropped to my knees amidst the broken glass, ignoring the sharp sting as a shard sliced into my bare knee. I let out a piercing, agonizing scream that echoed off the high ceiling. "He is gone!" I shrieked, clutching a piece of the shattered frame to my chest. "Julian, he is really gone. I saw his coat in the hallway, and I just could not stop walking. I just want him back, please. God, I just want my husband back." I rocked back and forth on the floor, sobbing so violently my entire body convulsed. It was the most physically demanding performance of my entire life. I channeled every ounce of genuine terror and rage I felt into a display of complete, pathetic hysteria. Julian stopped in his tracks, the dark suspicion on his face slowly dissolving into a mixture of extreme discomfort and arrogant pity. To him, I was not a threat. I was just a mentally unstable, grieving widow having a severe psychological breakdown in his office. Sylvia rushed into the room a moment later, gasping at the sight of the blood on my knee and the shattered glass. "Good heavens! Layla, Julian, help her up." Julian sighed heavily, the tension completely leaving his shoulders. He reached down and hoisted me to my feet, dragging me away from his desk. "She is completely losing her mind. Mother, get her a towel for that cut and call her a car. She needs to go home." An hour later, I was sitting in the secure, soundproofed back seat of Harrison Thorne's armored vehicle, parked 3 blocks away from my empty house. I handed him the small black flash drive. My knee was bandaged, and my hands were finally steady. Harrison plugged the drive into a portable decryption terminal on his lap. Lines of complex data flooded his screen. He remained entirely silent for 10 long minutes, his eyes scanning the stolen information with terrifying speed. "You did it, Layla," Harrison finally said, his voice laced with grim satisfaction. "We have the absolute entirety of their network, the false prescriptions, the bribery logs for the medical examiners, the wire transfers. It is a masterpiece of criminal evidence." "Then we take it to the authorities," I replied sharply. We end this now. We cannot, Harrison said, his jaw tightening. He pointed a long finger at a flagged email communication on the screen. Look at this date stamp. Julian just sent an emergency directive to their offshore bankers during that phone call. They know the federal regulators are starting to ask questions about the hospital's mortality rates. They are liquidating everything. I leaned forward, reading the horrific details of the message. They are moving over $50 million to untraceable accounts in the Caymans, and they are doing it by the end of this weekend. Once that money crosses international borders into those specific phantom accounts, it vanishes forever, Harrison explained coldly, and once the money is secure, they will flee the country on a private charter. If they leave American soil, they will never face justice for Elias or for my daughter. I looked at the digital clock on the dashboard. It was Thursday night. We had less than 48 hours before my family became untouchable ghosts. Tomorrow night is the annual charity gala for the Meridian Medical Foundation, I said, my voice hardening into a weapon. Sylvia and Julian will both be there. They have to attend to keep up public appearances before they run. They will be surrounded by the hospital board, the mayor, and hundreds of wealthy donors. Harrison slowly closed the laptop, a dark, understanding glint in his eyes. You want to trap them on stage? I want to burn their empire to the ground in front of the entire city, I corrected him. We have the data. Now I just need a confession, and I know exactly how to make my mother talk. The grand ballroom of the Seattle Plaza was a glittering sea of crystal chandeliers, flowing champagne, and absolute hypocrisy. It was exactly 8 o'clock on Friday evening. Over 500 of the city's wealthiest elites, prominent politicians, and senior hospital board members were gathered for the annual Meridian Medical Foundation Charity Gala. It was a flawless masquerade ball designed to wash the blood off my family's money before they smuggled it across international borders in less than 24 hours. I stepped out of the elevator and into the suffocating warmth of the hall. Wearing a floor-length, backless black silk gown, it was the traditional color of mourning. But tonight, it felt like the uniform of an executioner. Resting heavily against my collarbone was an antique silver locket Elias had given me on our first anniversary, hidden beneath the polished metal casing. Harrison Thorne's engineers had installed a military-grade micro-audio transmitter and a localized cellular signal jammer. I was a walking surveillance tower. As I glided through the crowd, accepting hollow condolences with a stiff, practiced nod, I tracked the invisible net closing around the room. The catering staff pouring vintage wine and the stoic security guards flanking the emergency exits were not hotel employees. They were Thorne's elite private security operatives. Every few minutes, a waiter would casually adjust their earpiece. Deep in the bowels of the building, a specialized tactical unit was silently clearing the central audio and visual control room, zip-tying the legitimate technicians, and seizing absolute control of the entire electronic infrastructure of the gala. The trap was meticulously set. At exactly 9 o'clock, the lights dimmed, and a hushed silence fell over the massive ballroom. Julian stepped confidently up to the grand podium, perfectly illuminated by a single dramatic spotlight. He adjusted his tailored tuxedo, his face projecting an image of profound, dignified sorrow. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice echoing smoothly through the towering speakers, "we are gathered here tonight to celebrate the future of medical innovation. But my heart is tethered to the past. Just last week, our family suffered an unimaginable tragedy. We lost a brilliant mind, a loving husband, and a true brother. Elias Wright was a man of unparalleled integrity." Julian paused, lowering his head and subtly wiping a meticulously timed fake tear from the corner of his eye. The crowd murmured in collective sympathy. "In his honor," Julian continued, his voice rising with theatrical passion, "we are establishing a new pediatric trauma wing. We ask you to open your hearts and your checkbooks to help us continue his legacy of saving lives." The sheer audacity of his performance made my stomach churn with violent disgust. He was standing on the grave of the man he murdered, using his name to solicit millions of dollars from oblivious donors. I could not listen to another syllable. I turned away from the stage and slipped quietly through a side corridor, heading directly toward the soundproof VIP lounge elevated above the main floor. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors. The room was utterly silent, the roaring applause from the ballroom completely blocked out by the thick acoustic paneling. Sylvia stood by the panoramic glass window, a crystal glass of expensive bourbon in her hand, looking down at the wealthy crowd like a queen surveying her flock of sheep. "You should be down there, Layla," Sylvia said coldly, not bothering to turn around. "People expect to see the grieving widow standing bravely by her brother. It drives up the donation percentages." I walked slowly to the center of the room, my fingers brushing the silver locket at my throat. I pressed the hidden mechanism, activating the transmitter. A microscopic green light pulsed against my skin. "I am done playing the fragile victim, Mother," I said, my voice dropping the facade of weakness entirely. It was sharp, clear, and ringing with absolute defiance. Sylvia finally turned, her brow furrowing in irritation. She took a slow sip of her bourbon. "Watch your tone with me. You are emotionally unstable. Do not ruin this night. Tomorrow, everything changes, and you will be well taken care of." "By being left behind to take the fall for your offshore accounts," I countered, closing the distance between us. I needed her angry. I needed to pierce that bulletproof arrogance. Elias figured it all out, did he not? He found the fake prescriptions. He found the laundered money. He knew you were bleeding patients dry to line your own pockets. Sylvia's eyes widened for a fraction of a second, a flash of genuine shock breaking through her icy exterior, but she quickly masked it with a cruel, mocking laugh. "Your husband was a glorified accountant who stuck his nose where it did not belong. He was weak. Layla, just like you. He thought he could play a high-stakes game against people who built an empire. He was 10 times the person you will ever be," I hissed, stepping so close I could smell the alcohol on her breath. I injected every ounce of contempt I possessed into my next words. "And you were so terrified of him, you did not even have the courage to face him yourself. You had Julian bribe a cheap mechanic in a parking garage. You are not a criminal mastermind. Mother, you are just a pathetic coward hiding behind hired thugs." Her face twisted into an ugly, unrecognizable mask of pure, unrestrained malice. I had struck the exact nerve I was aiming for. Sylvia's ultimate weakness was her towering, pathological ego. She could not stand being called weak. "Do not you dare call me a coward," Sylvia snarled, slamming her glass down onto the table so hard the crystal fractured. "We built a multi-million-dollar dynasty from nothing. That pathetic husband of yours was about to tear it all down over some misplaced sense of morality. He was a threat to everything we created, so yes, we dealt with him. Cutting his brake lines was a necessary sacrifice for the family empire, and I would do it again in a heartbeat." Her words hung in the suffocating silence of the VIP room, vicious and undeniable. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply looked at her with the cold, detached gaze of a surgeon who had just successfully isolated a lethal tumor. "Thank you, Mother," I whispered, taking a deliberate step backward. Hundreds of feet below us, in the secured audio-visual control room, Harrison Thorne stood over a glowing mixing board. He listened to the crystal-clear audio feed transmitting from my locket, with a single, sharp nod to his chief engineer. Thorne locked the heavy steel doors of the control center, isolated the building's main network, and placed his hand firmly over the master broadcast switch. The trap had snapped shut. I walked out of the soundproof lounge and stood on the edge of the overlooking balcony, staring down at the glittering sea of wealthy donors, down on the main stage. Julian raised his crystal glass high into the air, his fake smile gleaming perfectly under the bright spotlight. "Please, everyone, raise a glass," Julian projected into the microphone, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "To family, to legacy, and to Elias." That was the exact cue. I looked directly at the nearest security camera hidden in the chandelier and gave a single, sharp nod. Instantly, every single light in the massive ballroom snapped off. The venue was plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. A collective wave of confused gasps rippled through the affluent crowd. 3 seconds later, the giant LED screens spanning the walls behind the stage violently flickered to life. They did not play the heartwarming charity video Julian had meticulously prepared. Instead, stark white documents splashed across the screens in massive dimensions. There were the offshore bank statements highlighting millions of dollars in illegal wire transfers. There were the forged corporate contracts bearing my duplicated signature. And finally, a crystal-clear, high-definition photograph of the underground mechanic Julian had bribed, complete with the digital transaction receipts and timestamps. The wealthy donors began to murmur frantically, pointing at the glowing screens in sheer shock. Julian dropped his glass. It shattered against the wooden stage with a sharp crack. Then, the true death blow was delivered. Over the towering, concert-grade speakers, a voice boomed with deafening clarity. It was the recording I had just captured in the VIP room above them. Cutting his brake lines was a necessary sacrifice for the family empire, and I would do it again in a heartbeat. Sylvia's vicious confession echoed off the high ceilings, bouncing off the walls like a physical weapon. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating horror. Then, the ballroom erupted into total, uncontrollable panic. "Turn it off!" Julian screamed, abandoning his podium and sprinting frantically toward the backstage control room. "Cut the power right now." He barely made it 3 steps. 4 waiters dropped their silver trays, lunged forward, and tackled him violently to the hardwood floor. Thorne's elite security operatives pinned Julian down, twisting his arms tightly behind his back. Up on the balcony, I turned around. Sylvia stumbled out of the VIP room, her face completely drained of blood. Her aristocratic, untouchable mask had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She looked at the giant screens, then down at the restrained Julian, and finally, her wide eyes locked onto me. She realized exactly what I had done. "Layla!" Sylvia gasped, her voice trembling with absolute terror. She reached out with shaking hands, desperately trying to grab my arms. "Layla, please, you are my daughter. You have to stop this." I stepped back, completely out of her reach. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me, and I felt nothing but the sterile, freezing detachment of a surgeon observing a severed limb. "I am not your daughter," I said, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "I am the doctor removing the rot." Before Sylvia could say another word, the heavy wooden doors of the ballroom were thrown open with a deafening crash. A dozen federal agents, armed with the complete investigative files Harrison Thorne had handed them an hour prior, swarmed into the venue. The flashing blue and red lights from the police cruisers outside painted the terrified faces of the elite guests. I watched with pure, unadulterated satisfaction as federal agents forced my mother against the glass balcony, harshly snapping heavy steel handcuffs onto her wrists. Down below, the press cameras flashed endlessly, capturing Julian being dragged away in chains. The empire was officially dead. 6 months later, the freezing rain of Seattle had finally given way to a bright, crisp spring morning. I stood on the front steps of the former rehabilitation center. The dark, oppressive energy that used to haunt this building was entirely gone. Using the $10 million life insurance policy Elias left me, heavily backed by a massive charitable grant from Harrison Thorne, I had bought the entire facility at a government auction. I looked up at the newly installed silver letters gleaming above the main entrance, the Elias Wright Hope Foundation. I walked inside, making my way up to the top floor and stepping into my new office. The sterile, cold hospital environment of my past felt miles away. I poured myself a cup of warm coffee and walked over to the large window. The morning sun was rising over the city skyline, casting a warm golden glow across the room. I touched the antique silver locket resting against my collarbone. I was no longer the fragile victim of a sociopathic family. I had become the fierce protector of a legacy left behind by a man who loved me far more than his own life. The suffocating darkness was finally behind me, fully surrendering to the beautiful, undeniable dawn. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. Dear friends, Where in the world are you tuning in from? Please let me know down in the comments. If you found today's journey compelling, please help us keep this channel alive by joining our Patreon. Over there, you will gain access to our absolute best, most exclusive true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can easily scan the QR code right on your screen, or use the Patreon link provided in the description and pinned comment below. Stay safe, and I will see you in the next story.